Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. In today's episode, we're talking all things medical astrology. Joining us today, we have esteemed astrologer Marcus Patchett. So thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
Thanks, Callum. Good, very good.
Wonderful.
Excited to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. So what we're going to do today is look at the differences between a couple of the charts. So maybe a consultation chart, a decumbiture chart, and bringing in Horary as well. So could you explain the differences here and when we're talking about medical astrology?
Yeah, sure. So the great advantage of all three chart types is that you don't need a birth time for any of them. It's not to say that birth charts are unimportant. They're very important, but you don't always have an accurate, reliable birth time, whereas you can always use one of these three. So a consultation chart is what it sounds like. It's the chart of the time of a consultation. So that chart is going to be interpreted in the light of whatever is discussed in that consultation. So, a lot of astrologers will use consultation charts just to describe the kinds of things that will come up in a consultation. But in a medical context, you can interpret those charts specifically to talk about the illness that that person has brought to the table, basically, is asking you about. So the great advantage of those is that you don't even need to, hypothetically, you don't need to ask that patient's consent because you've just got the chart of that discussion. You don't need any birth data. You don't need any private details. But there are, the optimal in medical terms, if you don't have the birth chart, is the decumbiture chart. So decumbiture is just the name decumbiture comes from the same root as the word recumbent. I think it's Latin, and it means lying down. It means similar to lying down. So it'd be the time when somebody first got so ill they had to lie down, sort of thing. So a decumbiture chart could be the time of literally somebody getting really ill and having to lie down. It could be the time that they had an accident. It could be the time of a hospital admission. It can even be the time of receiving significant test results. So it's any significant time in the development of an illness. The closer to the origin point you can get with that, the better. But any significant sort of cross section can be a decumbiture time. So ideally, it'd be the time somebody first gets ill. The big limitation with decumbiture, which means you often won't have a decumbiture chart, is that as people don't usually sort of fall over and look at the clock.
Right. Too busy with what?
Yeah, exactly. You just don't have it a lot of the time. So, but they are considered slightly higher up the hierarchy of desirable charts than consultation charts because they're very specific to that illness, whereas a consultation chart will bring in whatever else is discussed in the consultation.
So in terms of a decumbiture chart, what if there are several events? So maybe test results come, they also know the time around an onset of an illness or symptoms, or the first time they lay down. So do you take a priority in those?
That's a really good question, and that does often happen. Particularly with astrologers who get ill, they'll often note several possible times. You know what I mean? Your average client who doesn't practice astrology may only have one time. They may have, I fell over on this day around 12 o'clock, but an astrologer might have several charts. So there's a couple of things there. Usually the chart of the most significant medical event is to be preferred if the time. So, in any disease process, in any illness, you'll have the big one, the one like the first symptom that came up that took you to the doctor or something, or the time when you collapsed and had to be taken into hospital and you've got that hospital admission time. So I'd take the big one over all the little ones, but I'd look if they had all the charts, I'd take a look at all of them. Because you often find fascinating sort of crossovers between I had a client last year who had a lot of dental issues, and because this client was interested in astrology, they had 3 or 4 charts for 3 or 4 separate appointments.
Oh wow!
And each of the first 3 charts had exactly the same ascendant and midheaven, but they just showed a different point in the process. Like the significators were the same. It was fascinating.
Wow.
And then the fourth chart they had was completely different, and that was because a new problem had emerged. It was fascinating. So the short answer to that one is you take whichever chart was most eloquent, whichever chart spoke to the most medically significant event.
Right. Okay.
And of course, with the big asterisk, that you want the chart with the time that is known for sure. So if somebody had the big event on a day when they're like, oh, I collapsed on somewhere between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. on this day, but they had a chart of a test result a couple of days later that was bang on the nose, I'd choose the test result chart just because I could be more secure about the time.
So ideally, anything that's written down in time, whether it's a medical,
yeah,
test
anything
result, anything
where
like
you've
that,
got
rather
a
than from
solid
memory, or it could have been around that time or something like that.
Exactly. If it's you still like if people aren't sure of the exact time, you can still look at the transits on the day if you've got their birth chart, or just see what the sky was doing in general. But you need an exact time for any one of these charts to work properly, because you need to know what houses, where the houses are.
Right.
And the last chart in the hierarchy, sort of at the bottom of the heap, so to speak, in terms of preference, specificity, I guess. Well, maybe it's the most specific but the least broad, the least number of uses, in a sense, is the horary chart. I'll explain what I mean. I'm starting to ramble. Basically, a horary chart is a chart of a question. So you just ask a question. So if you can't get hold of a Decumbiture chart and you haven't had the opportunity to have a consultation or a conversation with a client or a person or something, or let's say it's somebody like like your gran or something has got ill, then, and you haven't had a conversation with her and you don't know the time or any details of what happened exactly, you can always ask a horary question, and that's very useful. The limitation of that with by comparison to the other two types is that a horary is pretty much a one-shot chart. It'll answer the question, but then you can't open it out and do other longer term timing techniques. So say with a consultation chart or a Decumbiture, because they're basically sort of charts that are of a process that's either just beginning or ongoing, you can apply more timing techniques to them over time. Whereas a horary chart, because the way that chart is used, it's just answering a single question. It's got a more potentially limited time frame, I would say. I mean, astrology is always astrology, so the same rationale and broad techniques can be applied, but it doesn't, once it's had its use, you can't apply some of the timing techniques to it, I'd say, in the same way that you can with consultation charts and Decumbiture, if that makes sense.
Fascinating. Yeah, very, very interesting. So actually in front of us here, we've got a chart. Now, did you say this is a consultation chart as you've got here?
Yes. So yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is the chart of a consultation with a client I saw, as you can see, 2021, a couple of years ago. This was not an astrology client. It's a herbal client. But I always take a look at the consultation charts for all my clients just to see, what's likely to pan out, and to sort of get, as an astrologer, it's just for my own R&D more than anything else, So what we've got here, we've got the ascendant is 14 degrees Scorpio. So by convention, in consultation charts and Decumbiture, the sick person always gets the ascendant. And this is actually something from a rule from, I think, the Centiloquium of Ptolemy. He says the ascendant always, sick person always gets the ascendant. Not so in horary, FYI, because in horary, you are the person asking the question. So the sick person might be another person, the 7th house, or if it's your mom, it might be the 10th house, or if it's some kid you don't know, it might be the 5th house, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, in illness charts, the ascendant is the sick person. So here we've got 14 Scorpio rising, ruled by Mars at 26 Virgo, is the patient, is the person who's coming to see me. And I would be that Venus, the 7th house with Uranus in it there, exactly on the descendant, and Venus in Libra in the 12th. And then we've got the moon is the second significator of the patient. So this course that I'm doing, the MD 101A course, is about using predictive techniques. So prognosis in medical astrology. So just to give you a quick and dirty sort of couple of ways that I would do that. So the general and non-specific way of doing prognosis from a chart like this, you'd look at the sixth house and the planet that rules the sixth, because that's the illness. And you look at the first house and the planet that rules the first and the moon, because they all represent the patient.
So quick question about house systems. Are you using particular ones, or what is the room?
Very good point. Very good point, Callum. Yeah, because so what I use is Regiomontanus.
Okay.
So I use the quadrant system Regiomontanus. A couple of reasons for that. The first is I'm aware that some people will say this is a fallacy because it's an argument from history, but whatever. It's because William Lilly and some of the Renaissance astrologers after who I model my practice and my techniques did it that way. They used the Regiomontanus. The second reason is a philosophical one, because it seems to me that Regiomontanus is a division of the sky based on a division of the equator. Like basically you divide the equator into 12, project it on the sky, and that's the way that you divide the ecliptic. So philosophically, that seems to me very appropriate for medical astrology, where you're trying to do diagnostics, where it's like you're projecting the body of the earth onto the sky. So if you're trying to work out what organs are affected, it's like you're projecting the physical body of the earth onto the sky and then dividing it. So I use Placidus, for example, with natal astrology when I'm doing timing techniques, because Placidus is a division of time, it's arcs of time. But Regiomontanus I will tend to use for horary and for medical, because you're often dealing with physical stuff. And the whole basis of Regiomontanus is that you divide the girdle of the earth into 12 equal sections and project it onto the sky. So
I love how you have a philosophy for each system that you're using, but also when it was used, taking it back to the source of who was using it and where the source material comes from. So I like that. Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you. No, so I try and sort of like, it's not enough for me just to say, oh, that guy 500 years ago did it. I like to sort of like think, well, why might I then? And I thought, yeah, this makes sense to me. There are other practical reasons why I use quadrant systems. I do also use whole sign. I use whole sign in a sense of gauge. It gives a secondary overlay of meaning sometimes, and it helps me gauge strength of planets, so I do incorporate the whole sign, but particularly in medical, I just basically use quadrant. There's a practical reason I like quadrant houses as well, because I sometimes think the cusps can be very eloquent, because when a cusp of two different houses is ruled by the same planet, or three different houses, whatever number, the signification of those houses is tied together. For example, in this chart, we have Mars ruling both the first and the sixth. That immediately tells you that this patient is probably doing stuff that is aggravating their own illness. They might be in some way driving their own disease or be contributing to their own disease. The nuance there is, where is Mars? Well, Mars here is in the 10th house, 11th sign. So this person is going to be erring more towards benefiting their health than harming it, I would say. If Mars, on the other hand, was in Libra in the 12th sign, particularly if it was also in the 12th quadrant house, then they might be erring more towards driving their disease onward. Because do you see that? That's because that's the doctrine of beholding. Mars in this chart is in a strong house and is beholding or making a whole sign aspect to the ascendant, but is in aversion to the sixth house sign Aries. It's not making any traditional aspect to Aries. So it's like when a planet can see the sign it rules, in this case Mars can see Scorpio, but Mars can't see Aries. It's making no aspect. The word aspect literally means to see. So Mars can take care of Scorpio, but can't take care of the sixth house so much. Which
quite
is
interesting.
Actually,
so it seems like you're going around and you're doing the assessing the planetary strength. So go back to that point, if you had that Mars detriment in the 12th, aversion to the ascendant, and say it was retrograde, your other dignitaries,
Oh yeah,
like you said,
then you
direct,
really start piling it on. Then
right.
Yes, then firstly, I'd expect that person to be a lot more ill than, you know, and secondly, they might be doing more to actively drive their disease. They might have more vices or bad habits or behaviors that could be driving their disease. Let's say Mars was in Gemini in the 8th house, not so debilitated, not in detriment in Libra, but it again, not able to see the ascendant. And probably, so in that case, I'd say this person might be really anxious or grieving, some of those 8th house significations, and that anxiety or grief is exacerbating their disease in some way. So
how about the Mars dispositor? So the mixed reception between the Mars and the Mercury, isn't that fantastic?
Yeah, okay.
So you're evaluating all this. Sorry, okay.
No. Great. I love it. So yes, you could get into that, but I just want to first of all just take some general prognosis stuff. So Mars is not too weak here. I think Mars may even be in term at the end of Virgo. I haven't got my little table of terms. Haven't got the terms memorized. I'm not quite that.
I don't. I'm not on the top of my head.
Come
on in the chat. It's going to be out there.
Yeah. I think Mars is in term, but it's got, I think, certainly not super weak at the end of Virgo, in a reasonably strong house. The complicating factor, as I say, is that Mars also rules the 6th here. So it's likely that this person might be driving their disease. The second thing I'd look at is what sign is on the cusp of the 6th. Well, it's Aries. That's a movable sign, and its ruler Mars is in Virgo, which is a double-bodied or mutable sign. That immediately tells me that the illness might have acute flare-ups, but be quite changeable. Acute because it's a cardinal sign on the cusp of the 6th, and its ruler is in Virgo, which is a bit changeable. And with regard to what you said about the Mercury dispositorship or rulership of that Mars, that might say that maybe that person's mind or thinking, particularly related to maybe possibly speculatively to their relationships, or particularly to anxious thinking, because Mercury rules the 8th, could be a trigger for their illness in some way. That may be how that could play out that way. But anyway, so general dispositorship. The patient in this place is in this chart looks like they're in a reasonably good position to manage their illness. They might be partially contributing to it themselves, perhaps through anxious thinking. The illness is likely to have acute flare-ups, but be a bit changeable in its manifestation. So those are some general things. Then in terms of where's it going, you could look at what the moon is doing and what the ascendant ruler Mars is doing. Where are they going? Where are they moving towards? Well, the moon is moving towards, I think, is it a trine of Jupiter retrograde? So Jupiter here doesn't rule any of the bad houses. And by bad, in a medical context, I mean the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th. And Mars is going to enter Libra, where it loses some dignity, but then it immediately applies to trine Saturn. And in this context, that is actually a good thing, because Saturn receives Mars in Libra. And this comes from the work of Masha Allah. I think I've made Masha Allah's On Reception, which is there's a small booklet translation by Rob Hand and a translation by Ben Dykes in his big collected works of Salem Masha Allah. On Reception is a small little thin work by Masha Allah, which is so important if you're doing any kind of predictive astrology, because it just gives you the doctrine of like how to predict stuff using reception. In this case, I'd look at, so we've done the general, which is looking at the 6th house and the 1st house and whatever.
Just a quick question. What would you do with the orb? So I noticed that moon, which is obviously says very important. So you've got the applying trine to Jupiter and to, I think, Pluto here as well. So are you using particular orbs in this, or how do you work with that?
No, when I'm doing prognosis with this, I'm literally just looking at the actual. So I'd use solar fire in this case to sort of wind it forward. So let's see if we can do that, and literally see how many degrees there are, and then that number of degrees will be symbolically a particular number of days, weeks, months, or years, and then you can stack up the timings and see which makes the most sense within the context. or in the context of the situation.
Hmm.
Here, the key thing about this is with Masha Allah's technique, which you use the ascendant ruler or the moon, and you will use whichever one of those sees the ascendant, beholds the ascendant preferentially, because it has more control over the situation. So in this chart, I would use Mars, because Mars is in a sign that beholds the ascendant, the moon is not. So in other words, yes, where the moon's applying will always tell you something about what's coming up, you know, because that's the moon generally rules events and where they're going. But the overall,
you're finding more important significators than like you said, to the relationship to the ascendant, as you've just talked about. That's quite interesting.
It's weighting it. It's weighting it. So in this case, we'd weight Mars over the moon because it beholds the ascendant. If Mars was in this chart, if Mars had already gone into Libra, I might weight the moon more, because even in that case, they're both not beholding the ascendant, but they're both applying to planets that do behold the ascendant. So I'd probably go for the moon if Mars was already in Libra. Mars isn't. Mars beholds the ascendant. I'm going to work with Mars. So I can see from this that in about 3 degrees and 35 minutes, so that's 3.5 approximately, some things, Mars is going to get a bit weaker, maybe. That might be 3.5 months or years or whatever it is, because we don't know. Context might tell us. We could do some other timing techniques, and certainly if you've got the birth chart, you can use timing techniques on that to work it out. Patient might get a bit weaker, but then Mars goes on to trine Saturn. So I'll just wind this forward a few days to see exactly when Mars trines Saturn, and make sure that trine does complete, and it does. And it completes at around 7 degrees 02, I think, or 7 degrees 03, probably. 7 degrees 03 of Libra, I'm guessing, if we look at where Saturn is. Okay. So bottom line here is Mars, you could get the number of degrees and say, okay, this is the problem with symbolic timing. We'll cover all this in the course. You've got 2 different sets of units there. You've got 7 degrees 03 of Libra, Mars in Libra, and then you've got 3 degrees 35 minutes of Mars in Virgo. So Virgo, because it's a mutable sign, could indicate slightly longer units than Libra, which is a cardinal sign, because cardinal signs usually are faster. So they can indicate days or weeks, and mutable signs are usually a bit slower, somewhere in the middle, so they can indicate weeks or months. So that could be 3.5 months plus 7 and a bit weeks, or it could be 3.5 weeks plus 7 and a bit days. Or just to add extra confusion to it, you could just, the signs might not make that much of a difference. So you could just have whatever that is, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, like 11 and 2/3 of something. Do you know what I mean? Just like you can use the degrees as units. So the bottom line is, in the course, we'll cover all this. There are ways to just sort of work out which of those symbolic timings is more likely. And in my experience with astrology, it's often fractal. So you'll do this timing technique and you'll find that all of those timing things give some kind of, one of them will be the main one, but all of them will give some kind of development in the illness. Now, in this case, Mars applying to trine Saturn, Saturn is going to be receiving Mars, meaning that Mars in Libra, it's Saturn's exaltation. So Saturn looks upon anything in Libra favorably. He sort of looks at it and goes, oh, I'll have some of that. That's great. So Saturn trine, it's like Saturn is forced to be a good host to any planet in Libra. And this is by trine. So Saturn squaring the planets in Libra might be forced to be a good host, but he'll still be annoyed. He'll be annoyed about it, and he'll make things a bit difficult, even if he'll resolve it. Saturn trining, it's going to be fine. The only rub or issue here is that Saturn is retrograde, and any retrograde planet will ultimately reverse its decision eventually. It'll sort of come undone. So the way I see this is, this person is heading towards a bit where they might get a bit weaker, then they'll be stabilized, because Saturn won't necessarily improve. Like Jupiter will kind of like really level things up, and Saturn will just go, no, you're all right where you are, you know, and stabilize things for a bit. But then that stability might eventually come undone. Over the shorter term, I would probably look at the moon and say that Mars gets the the rulership of this prognosis in this chart, because it's the one that beholds the ascendant. Over the shorter term, I'd look at the moon because it's moving more quickly. It's less significant for what happens in the end of this particular process than the Mars is. But the moon here is applying to trine Jupiter, also retrograde. So what that says to me is over the short term, this patient should improve a fair bit, maybe not spectacularly because Jupiter's not super strong, but that improvement may again be reversible or may not last forever. Now, this particular patient was not super old, but fairly old and had a difficult diagnosis. So that to me that's pretty reasonable, you know, like you kind of want somebody to get a bit of improvement, to be stabilized, and for that stability to last for a while at least. I think that's pretty reasonable. So we'll go into a lot more detail in the course about the prognosis because you can finesse the timing. There's a lot of some of you will already have thought of questions about this, like, so what happens if both of the planets are in signs that don't behold the ascendant? What happens if they're both in signs that don't behold the ascendant and they're not applying to aspect another planet that beholds the ascendant or something? There's lots of different variations of this technique, but we'll cover all that. But broad strokes, you look at the ascendant, its ruler, and the moon as the patient, the sixth and its ruler as the illness, to give a sort of general idea. And then you'd look at the ascendant and the moon, the ascendant ruler and the moon, where they're going, to see where things are headed. So if, for example, Mars had been, say Saturn had been in Capricorn and Mars had been trining Saturn from Virgo, that might have been okay because Saturn was dignified, but it would actually have been less good than Mars entering Libra and trining Saturn because there wouldn't have been that reception. If Saturn had been in another sign, say Sagittarius, then it would have been that suggests a more difficult outcome because there's no reception, and Saturn and Mars without reception tend to be a bit gnarly. So does that therefore mean that that person is doomed? No, because with the astrology, you can always look at, so this is where the difficulty is going to be coming from. And we can maybe work out a bit of timing as to when those difficult events might be taking place. You can also then look at the chart to find some things that might be helpful. So I know, speaking to that, you'd always look at the ascendant and its ruler as representing the patient. So Culpeper, 16th century medical astrologer, said you always try and strengthen the ascendant whenever you want to strengthen the patient. So that can mean all sorts of different things in different contexts. So in the context, like, let's say this person was considering going for acupuncture, I might think, yeah, because they've got a Mars-ruled ascendant. Or let's say they were considering having colonic irrigation or something, not something I would normally recommend. In this case, maybe their medical team had said they wanted to give them some suppositories or some medication that went in the rear end or something, because that's all Scorpio. I think maybe that might actually be appropriate here, because those sorts of things might, on balance, tend to be more appropriate for this person. Also, you could look at Scorpio, Mars, Virgo in a more psychological sense and think maybe this person could benefit from doing some sort of elimination around their work practices. So Mars in the 10th in Virgo, perhaps they could clear out unnecessary work. Perhaps they could, so literally if they're swamped with files and stuff at work, just do a bit of a deep clean kind of job with their office, stuff like that to make themselves feel less stressed. So some of these basic techniques that you can always build in at the level of your competence and training, because if you're an astrologer who isn't, you're not a therapist, you're not like, you're not practicing medicine or anything, you just, you can still do useful things by using these charts on that level. You can speak to the patient, the client, and find out what's going on in their life, and then use the chart in that context. So if this patient said to you, oh yeah, I'm really busy at work. I'm actually really exhausted. You know, my filing system's completely chaotic. Why do I say all this? Because we have the sun, Mars is under the beams of the sun in the 10th, and is actually, the sun is getting closer and closer to Mars. So Mars is getting more and more combust. So that's indicative usually of somebody who's exhausted and got inflammation going on and can't see where they're going. And some of you may already have noticed that the sun is also what's called the almuten of the 6th, because in daytime charts, the sun actually has more rulership over Aries than Mars does, interestingly. So because the sun is the triplicity ruler of Mars during the day, and also the exaltation ruler. So I would still use Mars as the ruler of Aries because it's the domicile ruler, but you can use the sun as a secondary ruler of the 6th house in this case. So that shows this person getting more and more exhausted. Plus we have that sun and Mars opposing Neptune in the 4th. So I would say this is somebody who's working really hard and really conscientiously, but probably quite exhausted. And maybe that exhaustion or something about their working environment is draining them. And that could work on lots of levels. It could work on the level that this person has some sort of chemical sensitivity in their environment. Maybe their office or their office space at home or in their office block is, and it turned out that something like that was pretty near the mark, because it actually turned out this person had a lot of black mold in their home that was affecting them. So I think that's bringing in the Neptune opposition. But the point here is just using the Scorpio rising, Mars in Virgo. You could think, what's Scorpio about? It's about elimination. It's about removing things that are unnecessary. It's about purging. It's about letting go of stuff. What's Virgo about? Virgo also is about tidying, organizing, making things right, sort of, you know, just so that the common thread between Scorpio and Virgo to me is their desire to eliminate unnecessary things on different levels.
Getting rid and then cleaning up.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. So I think
this is quite fascinating. So what's your style of relaying this information to the clients that you worked in? How long have you been doing this yourself?
Okay. So no, good question. I think I've been doing, I mean, as a herbalist, I've been practicing since 2004, but as an astrologer, I started learning astrology in 2004, the year I started actually practicing as a herbalist. So I only started using a bit of astrology with clients in maybe 2007, really, really badly, in ways that now make me cringe. And then I sort of...
There's always that learning curve anyway. I mean, it's like following the ethical guidelines, but to...
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. It does take a bit of time. But so I started really doing more medical astrology for clients, I would say probably from 2013 onwards. I was already using it, but sort of building that in. I tend, day to day, I actually tend to use it most of the time alongside herbal medicine. Like I say, this particular client was a herbal client, not an astrological client. So in terms of how I'd use this information, for in that case, because I'm a herbalist, I use this chart to look at, okay, I've got a short list of plants I might want to use this person for this person, which ones might be most useful. So I'll use it to help actually as a Venn diagram. I've got my sort of herbal knowledge, and then I've got my astrological knowledge, and I'll use whatever's in the middle, you know. Wonderful. So I'll use it to help my prescription selection. So it's not based entirely on the astrology, but it's because, you know, but it's also not based entirely on biomedicine and my knowledge of plant pharmacology. It's what's in the middle. So that's one practical way I'll use it. And another way, just looking at a chart like this, I would have these things in the back of my mind when I'm having the consultation with a client. So when we start talking about their work, I'm already thinking of this chart, the consultation chart, and thinking they're probably exhausted. This person is probably overly conscientious, or maybe not overly, that's judgment, but they're probably very, very conscientious and very, you know, meticulous, and maybe need to just do a bit of purging as far as their work is concerned, you know, and just so organizing would be very beneficial. And maybe taking some of the, saying, you'd have to find a nice way of saying this, but taking some of the ego out of the work, like, because, you know, like a lot of us get very invested in our work and our identity becomes invested in the work. And I think with this chart is saying something like that to me, and the opposition to Neptune is sort of coming along, and dissolving it all in some way. It's like it's hypersensitizing it. Something about that ego identification with work and needing to be really in control of it is causing problems. But a chart will, as you know, astrology will often say things on several different levels simultaneously. So as well as indicating some of the physical issues in the space, it's also going to indicate some of the drivers behind the situation. So in terms of intervening, one practical way is you can just always think about in a consultation chart or decumbiture, the ascendant in that particular scenario is going to represent that person. So even if this person might natally be, I don't know, a Gemini rising, but because this particular scenario, talking about this particular illness, this consultation chart, or if we were using a decumbiture, same rules, had that rising sign with that significator, you'd think, how can I use that? Does that make sense?
Fascinating. And just touching again on some of the ethical considerations. So for people interested in the class, what comes to mind? What's the most important thing you'd like to convey in terms
loads.
of
There's so many with medical astrology. I mean, firstly, the big thing is you've always got to operate within your sphere, within the limits of your professional competence. Meaning,
that's why I'm too afraid to go near medical astrology. So
well, a lot of people are, and I don't think that's right, because I think actually everybody will have to deal with illness, and your clients will occasionally come to you asking you about their illnesses. So I think that's I understand it completely. I know so many astrologers who are petrified of it because they're like, oh, I don't want to get into it. But actually, as long as you advise within the limits of your professional qualifications and your competence, you are fine. So what you don't do is steam in and start giving medical advice. What you can do is look at the astrology, talk to the person about what's going on, and then say, so I gave you an example already, like it'd be no harm at all to you to say to this person, it might really help your stress levels to, declutter your workspace and just sort of detox your workspace in that way and organize yourself. You're already using medical astrology by suggesting something that will strengthen that person constitutionally or certainly psychologically, and thereby lower their stress. You're not actually getting into prescribing. Now, if you're a qualified if you're a doctor or a herbalist, or you're a Chinese doctor or whatever, you can utilize the astrology alongside your qualification as an extra filter to whatever to that discipline that you're already qualified and hopefully insured to do. But if you don't have a therapeutic practice, you can still utilize the astrology to sort of advise patients on a much more general level. And in terms of prognosis, this is where another minefield comes in, because people are like, what if the chart says something bad, like this was quite a serious diagnosis, somebody comes in with lymphoma or something, the chart looks hideous, then it's just, I think there's a line to be walked, but this comes up in astrology anyway. This is not something that's unique to medical astrology. This comes up when people come in and ask you about whether their family member's going to die. This comes in when people come in and talk about some trauma that's happened to them. This is not specific to just medical astrology. So in that scenario, you have to do what Lily called mixing discretion with art. You have to give people your honest professional opinion, but also I always try to skew it towards the positive. And so what I'll say to them typically, and I think all this is factually correct, and I'll give you the receipts in a minute. The first is that it's nothing set in stone with astrology. Nothing is ever set in stone. So this is just a weather report. So what this is going to show you is some of the likely patterns that are going to be unfolding over this period of time, and some of the times where particular things might come up for you. And we can use that information, first of all, to make sure that when these things happen, you don't panic. If something goes wrong at that time, you don't need to panic, because you and that we can put things in place that might help you do that. So if you in terms of putting things in place, for example, if it's a difficult chart and they've got a difficult prognosis, say you've got somebody with a cancer prognosis or some other difficult to cure disease or potentially terminal disease, and the chart looks like it's heading towards a difficult place, you can sort of look at that and say, here's some of the timing where things might get a bit more difficult, but then look at things that will strengthen the patient in the chart.
Right.
If you are not medically qualified, you can limit your advice on what is strengthening in the chart to the kinds of things I've talked about, just some general things like that might help that person. You do this in all forms of astrology. You talk to your client, you say, does this make sense to you? This is how I see this thing in the chart. Does that resonate with you? What do you think that means? The client tells you what, oh yeah, that's, you know, that thing in my 11th house, I had an argument with my friend last week. And then from that chart, you might say, well, making up with your friend might help or something.
So your natural interpersonal skills are starting to flesh out here.
Yes.
And as you said before, getting away from the definitive, you know, oh, everything will work out to the other extreme, which is definitely going to, you know, go up. So, but that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. So you can always work within the bounds you've and you can always find something constructive on the basis of the astrology to help guide that person to so there are some rules which again we'll cover in the course. So some things you can always look at in generically. So you can always look at any planets that have a good relationship with the ascendant ruler or the moon, as long as they aren't ruling any of the difficult houses like the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th in a medical context. You can look at, generally speaking, Jupiter and Venus, the benefics. As again, in this chart, I would favor Jupiter for 2 reasons, because it's a daytime chart, so Jupiter is slightly more powerful in general than Venus, and also Venus is in the 12th, which is a difficult placement. That said, that Venus being so dignified in the 12th house in medical charts is hospitals, and so in this case, this client, I might advise they could find really good help through possibly eminent female people in hospital, like maybe nurses, or it may not be female because Libra is a masculine sign, but Venus is traditionally feminine planet. So it could go either way, but they might actually find hospital care is really good for them. But I would generally look to Jupiter here. So I might think, so for example, any of those Jupiter in the 3rd house ruling the 4th and 2nd. So this could be siblings or cousins or neighbors who are really supportive, who could advise them, or just doing stuff to generally and in a sense, this matches the idea of that Mars in Virgo in the 10th. Jupiter traditionally is tidying up. Jupiter is making things, I think Lily used the phrase neat and sweet. So organizing communications, and Saturn there is limiting. So that sort of fits with what I said about his works, this person's workspace, like sort of tidying up the workspace, eliminating unnecessary work and sort of deleting stuff that's not helpful there. In terms of the communications, this could be literally limiting communications and tidying communications up. And on a practical level, this could be a regular fixed daily practice of some kind of either meditative discipline or something that fits that Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius in an air sign. So it could be some group communications therapy that could be regular. There's all sorts of different possibilities here, but in general, I would look at Jupiter and Venus. I'd look at the any planets that have good reception or good relationships with Mars, with the ascendant ruler, and with the moon. In specific, if you're talking about treatment, you look at the 10th house. So you look at the ruler of the 10th, if that's dignified. In this chart, the ruler of the 10th is Mercury in Libra, which is in the 11th house but 12th sign, and as you've already pointed out, Callum, it has a slightly sketchy relationship with that Mars, so I probably wouldn't advocate talking therapy for this person. Like if that Mercury had been really dignified, I might say that this person might benefit more from talking therapy. There's all sorts of ways you can nuance it, but the point about this, I've veered away from your initial question, which was about the sort of the ethics and sort of like some of those potential pitfalls. You can always look for the positive. You can always give a truthful response without making that person feel doomed. You can just sort of give a timeline of, okay, this is when difficulties might come up. And what I also emphasize is that the timelines in astrology, I think, are somewhat fractal. So if you have a difficult diagnosis with a difficult aspect applying, and it looks like it's coming to a potentially difficult conclusion, you can emphasize the fact that nothing's set in stone, that the information that you get through the astrology can be used to make positive changes, and that timing can be elasticated. So you can balloon that out from maybe 5 months to 5 years, maybe even 5 decades, So there's it's not necessarily the case that excuse me, just going to plug my laptop in.
That's okay. I do that all the time.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily the case that a difficult aspect in a difficult chart is the final word on a thing. There's always things from the astrology that will point you towards helpful people, helpful scenarios, helpful bits of advice or recommendations.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think that's a beautiful description. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for the excellent chart example and going through that. It's very, very interesting. So it sounds like to me, this class, that in terms of prerequisites, having to at least have a solid understanding of essential dignity and debility. And what do you say for students who are interested in taking this course?
That's a really good question. There is a little quiz on, it's actually connected to the MD 100 course, which is the Introduction to Medical Astrology course, which students can take. It's free. It's just a little quiz that, and if you pass that quiz, you're probably okay to do this course, because it'll just take you through some of the astrological ABCs that might be useful for this. So, but just to give a broad view, yes.
That's a good point. And what I'll do is I'll put that quiz below this video in the description. So anybody watching that, take that quiz just to check if you're unsure, maybe at this level of coming into Marcus's class. So yeah, great point.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Just generally, I think, yeah, understanding essential dignities. So obviously on the basic, that's exaltation, domicile or rulership, and their opposites, detriment and fall. But knowing a bit about the other dignities like triplicity, term and face, or decan, term or bound, or face and decan. They've both got two names, don't know why. Yeah, that's helpful. And knowing a bit about terms like reception, anticia, beholding, what else would be useful? Yeah, I think that, but just if you do the quiz, that will give you a good sort of like, if you can pass that quiz, you're probably okay.
You'll be fit to come in. Fantastic. Yeah. And I believe this is going to be, it starts, is it May 6th? Did I get that right?
Yes, I think so. I think it's Saturday, May the 6th. I can't remember whether it's 11 or 12 Pacific.
But again, we'll put the link below this video in the description. We'll have throughout this video.
But it's Saturday, 6th of May, and it's just a 5-week course. And this one will be focusing mainly on prognosis with a little bit of remediation. So it's just covering some of those, going into much more detail into the kinds of things I've been talking about today, where you're going to be looking at using consultation charts or horary charts or decumbiture charts to predict how things will go, what kinds of events will happen and when, and then what kinds of remedies or things can you suggest on the basis of the chart. And woven in and amongst that will be discussions of things like the importance of context, ethics, legality, all that kind of, important stuff. And then there will be a second course that will follow on from that and build on that, which will be more about the diagnosis from medical charts and how do you use these kind of charts to diagnose. And again, with a bit more remediation, or what advice, what constructive remedies can you give as an astrologer coming from that? Because after all, I think our job is not just to analyze, which is very useful, or just to predict, which some astrologers won't even touch. it's more so, I think, to provide guidance. I think that's what we're supposed to be doing. So yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So fascinating. And again, just to reiterate, we'll put the link below this video in the description. So absolutely fascinating. And again, thank you for sharing your insights with us. And it's something, actually, it's not a branch of astrology I know too much about. So I'll be interested in looking into some of those classes myself to take a look. So is there anything, any final words about what students might expect, or any final thoughts on that?
Not really. I mean, the thing is, I've made the course hopefully to be quite user friendly, as in, like, you're not going to be flooded with coursework. I think students are often a bit concerned about that. So that there's one forum, there's a forum every week where I post one question that I like everybody to interact with and think about. And I'll often put some sort of like little ethical dilemma or something that will come up in practice. And then for each week there'll be a quiz, a 10-question quiz, and at the end of the course there's a very short exam, like with 3 questions on it. So I think that's important to get across. In terms of what we'll be covering, this course, as I say, it's just prognosis. So I think we open with a bit of an exploration of a couple of William Lilly Renaissance Horary astrologers' charts, and we sort of take those apart and look at some of the techniques he was using. And then over the next sort of 3 or 4 weeks, we'll put some of those techniques in place and add to them a little bit in terms of prognosis. And then we end with a little bit of remediation. Okay, so now you've done a bit of prognosis. How would you use that to guide a client constructively? So yeah.
Wonderful. Fascinating. Well, thank you again so much, Marcus. And lastly, where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work or what you do? Where's easy?
All right. I always forget about that bit. Yeah, I do have a website. It's Nocturne, but that's more of a booking consultations-y kind of website. I do tutorials. So if people want to book in for your tutorial, that's fine. It's good, more than fine. But that's nocturnalherbalist.com. That's mainly my booking site. Other than that, I've got a small YouTube channel called The Nocturnal Herbalist. I mean, I haven't uploaded a video for yonks, but I do occasionally put stuff on there. Do you know what I mean? So there's a bit of herbal stuff on there and a bit of astrological stuff on there, and some combinations of the two. So I think that's about it. I mean, I've got a Facebook thing, but whatever.
Social media, we'll see what happens with it.
yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much, Marcus, for joining us today. And
thanks,
for everybody watching, again, we'll have the links in the descriptions and pop-ups throughout this video. So certainly check that out. It'll take you straight to the website if you want to register with more information there. So thank you all for watching. And again, thank you, Marcus, so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Colin.
Wonderful. Goodbye, everybody.